My mother was a smoker. She smoked her whole life. She was addicted to nicotine. She started when she was 16 years old.
Did you hear this video clip when it went viral back in the fall of 2015? It's New Jersey Governor Chris Christie during his presidential campaign.
But by the time 1964 came, the Surgeon General's report came out, and she was in her mid-30s, she knew that smoking was bad for you. And I tell you, I watched her as a kid growing up. She tried everything she could to quit. She had the gum, the patches, hypnosis. She tried everything.
The governor was relating this story to a gathering of New Hampshire voters.
Now, when she turned 71, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. We know the lung cancer was caused by the smoking. We know it was. But no one came to me and said, hey, listen, your mother was dumb. She started smoking when she was 16. Then after we told her it was bad for her, she kept doing it. So we're not going to give her chemotherapy. We're not going to give her radiation. We're not going to give her any of that stuff. You know why? Because she's getting what she deserves. No one said that. No one said that about someone who had cancer. Yet somehow, if it's heroin or cocaine or alcohol, we say, well, they decided they're getting what they deserved.
Christie told this story about his mother, and then another one about a law school buddy who was found dead of an overdose after a long addiction to opioid painkillers. We often hear about narcotics such as OxyContin and Percocet prescribed for pain management, then evolving into an addiction. Once the prescription runs out and the addict can't afford the opioid street prices, he transitions to heroin because it's cheaper, more available, and more potent. But speaking about one's mother or close friend with an addiction is one thing. What the governor said next blew my mind.
I'm pro-life. And I think that if you're pro-life, that means you got to be pro-life for the whole life, not just for the 9 months they're in the womb. The 16-year-old teenage girl on the floor of the county lockup, addicted to heroin, I'm pro-life for her too. Her life is just as much a precious gift from God as the one in the womb.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting, this is Us and Them. It's the podcast where we tell stories from America's cultural divides. I'm Trey Kay. In this episode, we're continuing our conversation about heroin and how it's come out of the shadows and is back with a vengeance. So we just heard Chris Christie speaking empathetically on the issue of substance addiction. And what blew my mind about Christie's remarks is here's this conservative politician saying these things in the middle of a Republican primary campaign, in which all the candidates are clawing and scratching to occupy the toughest, most conservative positions on issues from immigration to fighting terrorists. And here's Christie taking this compassionate, almost touchy-feely position towards drug addicts. And he's not alone. This is a major theme for presidential candidates looking for votes in New Hampshire, where more than one person died each day on average in 2015. Something has shifted in the way the nation's leaders are thinking about and talking about drug addiction these days. Why? Well, we're going to try to answer that in this episode.
Where are we going?
Haverhill. We're going to Haverhill to check in with my case manager so she can see how I've been doing and to take a drug screening.
We're hearing some audio from my co-producer, Mitch Hanley. He went on a car ride with a guy from New Hampshire who has recently kicked a heroin habit, and he's trying to stay clean. I asked Mitch to come onto the podcast and tell me about his experience with this guy. Hey, Mitch.
Hey, Trey.
So who is this guy you followed?
He didn't want to use his real name, so let's call him Steve. And he's from a small town in New Hampshire. Last August, he got busted on heroin possession in Massachusetts and was recommended for a drug diversion program. I spoke with Steve and his dad on their car ride to his pee in a cup session. He told me about how he came upon opiates as a teenager.
When I was 16 is when I first tried painkillers. It was the oxycodone 5 milligram tablets. I found them in my mom's medicine cabinet when I was getting Tylenol one day and just really wanted to see what the big deal with them was. So I decided to take a couple and save them for school the next day. I had midterms. And prior to going to class, I took the 3 pills and, waited about 15 minutes before I started noticing any effects. And I started liking, the way they made me feel. But not even an hour later, I got ill because I had taken too much for that being a first-time dose.
And did you think it was going to be a performance-enhancing drug?
I did. I kind of
Really?
did. I figured it would have relaxed me, mellowed me out and allowed me to focus. And so that's what I was expecting, but I had no idea that it was going to make me ill like that.
When was this? And how old was Steve at the time?
This was back in 2011, and Steve was 16.
And I understand that sometimes teenage substance abusers learn their behavior from their parents. I mean, was this a case where either his mom or dad had a substance abuse problem?
No, actually, these oxycodone pills were from Steve's mom, who had recently undergone hip surgery. And but when Steve saw them, he told me his adventurous, "I'll try anything" spirit kicked in.
I just heard from kids getting surgery, from getting wisdom teeth taken out, and that they were this drug that made you feel really good and you could just relax on and just kind of vibe out. And that's what I was, looking for.
What did you know about the downsides of this at that time?
I never really knew that it was just like heroin in a pill form. I never knew any of that stuff. I just kind of looked at it like it was prescribed by a doctor. What could be the harm in it? Just like that's how I thought about Xanax and Klonopin and other drugs that I took before trying to get high.
Prior to the
oxycodone.
Were most of your friends doing this too, or?
No, when I was growing up in high school, all of my the friends I hung around with, none of them, did drugs. It was just me and my buddy, would smoke weed with a couple of the kids on the football team and stuff.
So before this, what was the attraction to just general experimentation? You were just curious?
Absolutely, it was a cocky attitude stage that you can try most of these things and not get addicted to them whatsoever.
So you did your midterms and you got sick and you were like, okay, maybe I took too many, I'll try it again. Tell me about that experience.
So, I looked at it like, oh, maybe, I just wasn't used to them. The more and more I kept doing them, I got used to the effects and it would no longer make me nauseous, so I would just be high for hours without having any negative effects whatsoever. And then when the drug wore off, there was no come down, there was no burnout feeling like after you smoke a bunch of weed, there was none of that, or no hangover like when you drink. So it was just like getting high at that point.
Mitch, a lot of teenagers experiment with alcohol and drugs, and often without many consequences. But I wonder when Steve figured out that he was in over his head.
Steve realized he had a problem and actually told his sister he was addicted to painkillers. She told their parents, and he went through a treatment program heading into his senior year and was effectively clean. Later that year, he started working for his sister's husband doing construction. But his brother-in-law actually became, in his words, his partner in crime.
I could still get high on oxycodone. I just wanted to try heroin to see what was the big deal about it, to see what all the fuss and how people so-called got addicted on the first try, which I found out that day, absolutely.
Yeah, around this time, about 2 weeks after he graduated from high school, this brother-in-law helped Steve cross over from prescription opiates to street heroin.
I was watching his son, and he came over, and he told me at that point that he could get it, but it was going to cost $100. So I gave him the $100, and I stayed home watching his kid while he went out and bought it, and then he came back and picked me up, and then we drove to a gas station, and I snorted my first line, and it was almost like an epiphany, like, what have I done, and because I knew right away I was in trouble because of how much I liked it. the next day, I felt like the scum of the world. I felt like complete garbage, because once the high wore off, you realize like what you just did, and you think about what society has taught you what these heroin users are like. So immediately you start comparing yourself to what those people, and it just makes you feel like junk. And I felt like I'd stepped down in society in a sense, because most people, I thought, with a level-headed shoulder, head on their shoulders, would not ever think about trying heroin. So, but I took that step, and it made me feel awful. But the thing is, that only lasted for about a day, and then the next day I was already texting my brother-in-law, like, hey, when can we get that stuff again?
Before long, Steve's dad, Frank, that's not his real name either, was getting hip to what was going on.
We didn't think he had a serious problem. We just thought it was like a recreational thing, because unfortunately it seemed like, that's what all the kids were doing in high school. It bothered us, but not as much as when we found out more was going on. Well, a lot of the things that we started like picking up is tired a lot, sleeping, laying in bed. Then their face gets droopy because they're so relaxed and zoned out that they don't realize it. Then they find themselves like nodding off, bobbing for apples, and waking themselves up. I mean, my son-in-law one time almost fell face first in his Thanksgiving meal. I mean, that's how they get. It wasn't up until, like I said, later after we've seen it more, and then my daughter went through her separation, with her husband because of it. That's when we started figuring out that my son was probably on it too, and that's when we started picking it up. So one time I did call up my son-in-law, and he had told us, he says, yeah, he goes, he's getting high. He finally confirmed what we had our suspicions on.
Now, just to be clear, the son-in-law confirmed to Frank that Steve had been using. Is that right?
That's right. And Frank says he felt powerless in intervening in his son's drug problem. He actually told me one time when Steve was in the shower, clearly strung out on heroin, he tried to call the cops to take his son to jail. But the cops told him that there's no law against being high in your own house. And, as Frank said, his daughter separated from her husband. At that point, Steve also stopped working for his sister's ex. So Frank, he's a professional plumber. He hired Steve to work with him. This was partly so he could keep an eye on his son. But Steve, told me he'd get his paycheck, pay his bills, and then go get high with his partner in crime, his ex-brother-in-law.
When you do something wrong like that, you don't want to be alone. You want someone, that's going through what you're going through, so you don't feel so isolated and such like a loser in a sense. So I'm going to use with him so I don't feel like I'm the only one that uses drugs.
Eventually, Steve was asking his dad for advances on his paycheck. But things got worse as the addiction continued to consume him.
His money was always gone when he's working. I just found out that, like I said, I was supporting his drug habit. There were times where I had to go where I thought we were getting clean. He owed his dealer $300. I drove, I paid, and it's like, look, this is it, Okay, you gotta get clean, this and that, but finding out what they do from us going to parent meetings on this, me and my wife, that they tell you what you want to hear. Not that they ever have intentions of getting clean, and that's what they're good at. They're the biggest liars you'll ever meet in your life.
So, his dad paid off his debt to his dealer? Was Steve still in some sort of treatment program at this time?
Steve says that he wanted to get clean, but he just couldn't. And so last summer, he began a Suboxone treatment program. And Suboxone is kind of like methadone. It's an opioid replacement therapy, which basically blocks the effects of taking opiates. The program required that Steve meet with a therapist and successfully pass 3 drug screenings.
How did he do?
Well, the bad news was that Steve failed all 3 urine tests, testing positive for opiates, and was kicked out of the program. He went to his last therapist appointment August 26th, 2015, and just as a heads up, at this point in the recording, you can really hear the rain coming down.
Saw my therapist in Manchester, and I got my paycheck. It was a Wednesday, so I wanted to go get high after. I drove down to Lawrence like I did on most occasions. As I was pulling into the plaza, and I met up with my guy and, going to buy my drugs in one of the stores, he said, there's police here in the parking lot, we gotta go to the other store. So I saw the cops arresting somebody. They were narcotics officers. And I met him at the Family Dollar. I got my stuff, I left, and I drove to the Taco Bell right across the street, not even thinking about the cops, that were right across the street. And I started setting up my stuff to do a shot.
What does that look like?
I had a bottle of water in my car. I took the cap off the Dasani bottle. I sucked up some water. I opened the bag, dumped some in the cap, squirted the water in, and I was mixing it up. And it was, I had the cotton ready to drop in the water. And at that point, I saw out of the corner of my eyes two guys with guns pointed at me, walking up to the car. And right there, I knew I was busted.
Dang.
Yeah. What Steve didn't know was that there was a massive narcotics sting called Operation Cold Turkey going on. And police from a few different towns in Massachusetts arrested more than 250 people over July and August of last year. And the officers actually told Steve how they spotted him.
Oh, there's a kid with New Hampshire plates, looking down in his lap, parked, guarantee he's shooting dope. I was just so focused on what was in front of me. I had no idea they were sneaking up on me. I had no idea they even pulled in the parking lot. Like they said, if you're young and you're white, you really have no business being, in Lawrence by yourself, especially if you're just sitting in the parking lot. They were shocked that, because usually they're used to seeing white kids, but most of the, kids they deal with, like you could tell, haven't showered in, so many days. They stink, their cars are a mess. Almost like a shock to them to see, like, someone that looked like people they do business with,
Here's Steve's dad, Frank.
It was a shock in the beginning, but I can't say I was surprised, because it's, it's just a matter of time, or something. Either he kills himself or he gets caught. Every parent fears that they're going to get that call that, their kid died of overdose,
So in some ways, this was a relief?
Yeah, it was.
Well, how did it work out? I mean, did they throw the book at Steve in Massachusetts?
Because this was his first offense, the prosecutor offered him a deal. If Steve successfully completed a drug diversion program, the charges would be dropped and his record cleared. So he needs to complete this program successfully, or the charges could be brought back up against him. And, he's committed to it. And that's where we are today, 6 months later. Here's Steve literally walking into the place where he'll piss into a cup.
Well, I'm glad this is my last day, but I tend to get a little nervous. I tend to get a little, stage fright.
Okay, I think we're all set.
Thank you.
Yes, he did. He's such
It's my last one.
Oh, good.
You're gonna miss me, right?
I'm gonna miss you so much.
So you did your program?
Yep.
6 months? How much?
Yeah, 6 months. Time goes by fast.
You done?
How
What you have? That's good.
It's good. All right.
Good luck.
Thank you. It's funny because I get like bladder shyness. Like I'll pee for them. I'll force whatever I can out. As soon as they walk out, I can pee. It's all good.
And when that was all done, I rode back to New Hampshire with Steve and his dad.
That's all set.
Steve told me that the diversion program has helped keep him clean and that he's a little nervous about going forward without the safety net of that program. Steve's very aware of heroin's potential to still overpower him.
Do you still crave heroin?
I do. It's not like a daily thing like it was a while ago, certain things will trigger me, whether it be locations that I've used at, or just hearing about it a lot, or seeing it, or on TV or whatnot. I feel like to not get cravings, that's not really possible, especially for the first at least couple years of recovery, but it's just how easy they get to control, and it's almost like tearing a muscle. It'll tear and then it'll grow back stronger. So it's every time you say no to a really, really tough craving, it gets easier and easier with every single time you say no. So it's getting easier, but there's definitely times I still crave heroin.
Now the true test comes, I guess. Okay, this is something he had to do, whether he wanted to or not. He had to do it, or could face charges and maybe some jail time. Now, 6 months down the road again, I mean, is he still clean? Now is he back on drugs because the program's over and you don't have to have any piss test weekly or meet anybody weekly? This is the true test, my opinion. I always knew he was a smart kid. He had a good head on his shoulders. I mean, he's not. A lot of people are telling me, even in work, inspectors are telling me that you got a smart kid there. He's something that could take over the business and make it successful. Through the whole process, I've learned a lot going through this with him, that, people with addictions aren't losers. They're just people who are in bad situations and need help.
Even if addicts are not losers, Frank still struggles with how law enforcement and parents like him can effectively help addicts.
It boils down to they got to come up with a strict law against heroin use, and whether they're
Heroin use or heroin distribution. Heroin use isn't a crime.
I'm just saying, it is a crime. It's killing people. Heroin use.
Heroin distribution is killing people. Using heroin is your own problem.
It doesn't matter.
It's a choice you make at the end of the day.
I don't care.
Whether you choose to heroin, who does that affect besides the person?
That's not the problem. It's killing these people. They want to get clean, but they can't.
They know the risk status.
But you knew the risk and you kept doing it. This is turning into an argument.
It is going to turn into an argument.
I say that they need these kids that are using. They want to get off, but they have no resources to go and get off.
So which is where we need the government's help.
I'm just trying to say they need a program.
But you just said said heroin use in general should be treated like a huge criminal act.
People who are addicted to heroin or who are using
should not be treated as
who
criminals.
Wanted to get off heroin, but they need to have something to get. They're not going to willingly go to a program if they don't. I even asked you today, if you did not get arrested, would you be off program? And you said no. So they need to be arrested. They know they need to be facing jail time.
Jail time does not fix anything. No, all jail time does is it delays the inevitable. All it does.
Let me ask you this, okay? Again, you feared going to jail, and you were all set with that.
But that's not everybody. How many?
Exactly. I'm not saying it's everybody, but if it helped 5 out of 10 people, it helped.
Mitch, when I listen to the father and son conversation, I feel like I hear the dilemma. I mean, I want to believe that Steve has turned over a new leaf and wants to stay clean and is going to do so. But I still keep thinking about what his father said earlier, that addicts are the biggest liars that you'd ever want to meet. I mean, I really feel the tension in this situation.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. And as I've been following up with Steve, I've been a little nervous about calling him.
Well, why?
Well, with so many stories in documentaries, we learn at the end of the program that the subject is actually back on heroin or worse, dead. And even though Steve is found working out at the gym helps with his cravings, I still don't know how confident he is in his own recovery support. But I plan to keep in touch with him throughout this process.
That's Mitch Hanley, my co-producer on Us and Them. He's been following a recovering heroin addict in New Hampshire. So we've been listening to a certain young man, a certain white young man with a heroin problem and how he's been treated in the law enforcement system. Coming up, we'll hear from a law professor who compares today's law enforcement approach to heroin use with yesterday's approach to the crack epidemic.
When it was young African Americans and to some extent Hispanics that were suffering from addiction, the only question was how to keep it away from others. The only question was how to police it.
I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them. which is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
So we've just heard from a recovering addict and his father, each with their own ideas on how to address the problem of addiction, law enforcement, and treatment. In some ways, these two views highlight the positions of a long-standing argument within our country. But they're also evidence of a shift of the center of gravity, where our country has been and where we are today. But if we've learned anything, maybe it's best to look back at where we've been and review the lessons.
Tell me, Sister Murphy, when are you coming round again?
In 1971, as U.S. soldiers returned from Vietnam, increasingly addicted to heroin, Americans told Gallup pollsters that drugs and addiction were the greatest threats to the nation. By June, President Nixon agreed and launched what became the War on Drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
This all-out offensive included mandatory minimum sentences for drug users, but it also created the first federal methadone treatment program. What began under Nixon was broadened and reinforced significantly under the Reagan and Bush administrations throughout the 80s, with increased mandatory minimum sentences and prohibitive messages like "just say no." President Reagan addressed the nation in September 1986 with his wife Nancy sitting by his side.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children. From the beginning of our administration, we've taken strong steps to do something about this horror. Tonight, I can report to you that we've made much progress. 37 federal agencies are working together in a vigorous national effort. And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels.
At this point in the war on drugs, throwing massive amounts of money at the problem still seemed like progress.
These are a measure of our commitment and emerging signs that we can defeat this enemy. But we still have much to do. Today, there's a new epidemic. Smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an explosively destructive and often lethal substance which is crushing its users. It is an uncontrolled fire.
Written as an anti-drug message, Grandmaster Flash's White Lines describes some of the double standards of the war on drugs.
Street kid gets arrested, gonna do some time. He got out 3 years from now just to commit more crime. A businessman is caught with 24 kilos. He's out on bail and out of jail, and that's the way it goes.
Each president since Reagan, including Obama, has upheld the policy of attacking supply and demand of narcotics. But this 45-year-old war on drugs has cost over $1 trillion, with more than 40 million arrests. As with the war on poverty and the war on terror, one wonders if this enemy can be defeated, no matter how much money we throw at it. But combating today's addiction crisis is no less expensive. The Obama administration recently called for over $1 billion in new funding to ensure treatment availability for drug addicts. Last October, the president came to my hometown of Charleston, West Virginia, to launch a new initiative to stem the country's upsurging opioid problem.
There's no us and they here. There's no us and them. This is all of us in every school, in every community, in every neighborhood, and it could be your child.
He chose West Virginia to launch this program because the state has the infamous distinction of having the highest rate of overdoses, more than New York or California.
We've all got a role to play. You understand that here in West Virginia. We want to make sure the whole country understands how urgent this problem is.
Today's West Virginians understand this, but the West Virginia that I grew up in, not so much. The heroin problem of the 70s and the crack epidemic of the 80s seemed like something that happened a million miles away to people who were very much unlike us. When I was in junior high and high school in the 70s, what I learned about heroin came from scary films that they'd show in health classes. These films were always set in some urban location and almost invariably had some funky Curtis Mayfield music in the background. I remember scenes of junkies convulsing and retching while they were going through withdrawal.
When I came down, I was sick. My stomach cramped up. I sweated and vomited. You know. It feels like everything has been drained from your bones, and your bones are hollow. They feel like nothing. Then you break out in a cold sweat.
The image that I came away with was that heroin was only a problem in cities like New York, Philly, Chicago, or LA. And the addict always seemed like some black or Hispanic teen in a squalid apartment or under a bridge with a needle in his arm. But this was my experience as a teenager in West Virginia. If this is your image of a heroin addict, you need to update your browser. Today, people are using heroin in all parts of the nation, still in the cities, but also in the suburbs and rural areas. As we have heard from Steve from New Hampshire, today's heroin addict isn't necessarily a person of color.
I think it's very clearly that these problems have spread to both white America, also rural America. Maybe most importantly, they have spread to places where people have some amount of political clout.
This is Echo Yanka. He's a law professor at Cardozo Law School in New York City.
It's not a surprise that candidates, and if I may go so far as to say Republican candidates who have made their perennial plank tough on drugs, are suddenly opening up to the ways in which drugs have harmed their family, their brothers, their sisters, their children, and why they're willing to reconsider it. And it's not a surprise when the drug epidemic are affecting Republican populations in Staten Island or New Hampshire or Vermont, where people have lots of access to their elected officials. And they're simply not going to listen. Now that it's their children, they're not going to listen to people simply demonize their children and respond with only force and policing.
I met Professor Yanka after reading his New York Times op-ed, When Addiction Has a White Face. In it, he compares the treatment offered to today's drug addicts to what was offered in the 1980s.
A crackhead was not somebody worth saving. Crackhead just denoted somebody who was worthless in a way. And if they weren't a crackhead, then they were a thug. This is how America treated past drug addiction.
And beyond repair.
Beyond repair. And let's be even more straightforward. Their failure was a sign of the weakness of the entire black community. Right? So the black community was seen as needing to pull itself out of this, get control of this. It's their problem.
Because, and noting the difference in our skin tone, we in the white community, we've got our stuff together. We don't have the problems. There apparently is something flawed in the moral character of people with dark skin. No? I mean, is that the way that you see at least us looking at you?
I think we can't be shy to say America has a story about black inferiority and black pathos. And it's a relentless story about what's wrong with them. And thus, when the same problem appears in the black community, it's a sign of what's wrong with them. When the problem appears like addiction does in the white community, it's a sign of a problem that has to be tackled, right? So, for example, one of the things I noted was when crack attacked urban America, our grand response was something like, just say no. The point there, of course, is it's up to you. You do something about it. Or put a different way, it's your fault. Nobody denies people have agency in the way their lives go. But suddenly, as you were saying, when we see white Americans being addicted, the conversation is much more about this could be your mother. This could be your brother. This could be your family member. It's an illness. And now people see with real humanity this idea that it doesn't get us anywhere to blame the individual drug addict, but rather we have to support them.
Now we have a public health problem when the face of the user is white.
That's exactly right. I mean, when it was young African Americans and to some extent Hispanics that were suffering from addiction, the only question was how to keep it away from others. The only question was how to police it. This kind of decency and compassion was utterly missing when we dealt with drug problems in minority communities.
I saw that you tweeted out an article in the New York Times that was speaking about the heroin problem and the people in New Hampshire speaking to the candidates during the primary. And you noted this one former narcotics officer who had spoke up about this, and he said this. He said, "I can't tell you what has changed inside of me, but these are people and they have a purpose in life, and we can't, as law enforcement, look at them any other way. They are committing crimes to feed their addiction, plain and simple. They need help." And as I look at the look on your face, that comment bothered you a little bit. I mean, it seems like his heart's in the right place, no?
Of course. And, again, the part of it that's encouraging is that he has come to the view that these are people with a purpose in life. The part of it's encouraging is you can see in one person the falling away of the view that it's not that they're drug addicts, it's that they're criminals. It's not that they're drug addicts, it's that they're violent. As though these things are separated. And suddenly he sees, well, wait a minute. Crime itself is a symptom of addiction. Violence itself can be a symptom of addiction. And we need to have wraparound support. The part that's heartbreaking is for him to say, "I can't tell you what's changed." I mean, this sort of dedicated ignorance that the entire country has decided to show it shows a lack of bravery. I can't imagine how for him he disconnects the changing racial complexion of addiction and why he's suddenly come to see addicts as people with a purpose. There's just no question what's changed.
Echo Yanka is a professor at the Cardozo Law School in New York City. He told me that he hopes that the indifference and callousness shown to blacks during the crack epidemic is just one of those unfortunate societal wrongs that might guide us to better practices and policies in the future. There are so many aspects of this addiction crisis that represent a turning of the tables from a time when we, the us, thought we were smarter and less deviant, and the addicts, or the them, had some sort of character flaw or weakness. But today, so many of us are living with addictions or love someone who continue to suffer that we're coming to have a new understanding of addiction, punishment, and treatment. What do you think? Are you someone who never in a million years thought that you'd be addicted to heroin, but are? Do you love someone who has this addiction monkey on their back? Or do you think that we've surrendered in the war on drugs and that all this compassion talk is just giving comfort to the enemy? Let us know on Facebook or Twitter at Us Them Podcast or through our feedback page at usandthempodcast.com. And remember, there's no ampersand. Hey, we have an update on Steve, the young New Hampshire man with the heroin addiction. When our producer Mitch Hanley followed up with him last week, he said that he dislocated his knee and is not working at the moment. He said that he was hurting pretty badly, but he also said that he was proud of himself, especially since he deliberately chose to recover without taking painkillers. You've been listening to Us and Them. This show was produced by Mitch Hanley, Lori Stern, and me, Trey Kay, and was edited by Sister Morphine and Cousin B. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music, additional music from the Rolling Stones and Grandmaster Flash. Mark Lerner designed our logo, Rita Kristofi and Mariana Trofimova designed our website at usandthempodcast.com and provide us with images for the web. Our intern is Sophia Tedesco.
And special thanks to the people at Project COPE in Lynn, Massachusetts, Nadia Cabana, Kristen Luongo, and Mark Kennard. They're the folks who introduced us to our friend Steve. The marvelous people at West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.